Pokemon starters are the first touchstone you get for any Pokemon generation, and are often emblematic of that generation's quality. Except for Gen 2, which is strange, because Gen 2 is a favorite among most fans, and I would argue their starters are kind of some of the weakest of the bunch. Look, I love all three of their designs, but I disagree with some of the stat decisions that were made. Except for Typhlosion. He's a wonderful boy. Anyway, I've already ranked the best and worst Pokemon in each generation, but when I did it, I specifically ignored the starters to give the rest of the Pokemon more of a fair shake, and that list was also taking into account design and availability. But what if I were to rank each starter group, but not just overall, how well each starter fares in their own region? Because depending on the Gym and Elite Four members of each region, that makes a big difference. So I did just that, and because this is much more detailed of a ranking than the previous one, I'll have to go one generation per video. Starting with the one that started it all, Kanto. So I probably don't have to introduce the Kanto starters. I mean, it's Charizard, Blastoise, and Venusaur. You look at any person on the street, and I guarantee you like 90% of them can at least name one of these Pokemon, or at least recognize one of its evolutions. I mean, these guys scream marketable plushie. But even though we know these guys, I do think it's helpful to at least go over some of their basic information, starting with the Bulbasaur line, of which we get Ivysaur and then Venusaur. They're grass poison the entire way through, and they're generally a special attacker. In fact, in Gen 1, they're the only quote-unquote special attacker, because in the first generation of the games, there was no special attack and special defense stat, just special, which it had 100, around 20 points higher than Charizard or Blastoise. The fire line of Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard are fire, fire, and then fire flying, and similarly, they are a special attacker, although again in Gen 1, their special stat was actually 80, so they were more of a speed-based Pokemon. And finally, the water line of Squirtle, Wartortle, and Blastoise. They're water the whole way through, and oddly enough, they're actually a defensive specialist, in later games having defense and special defense being their highest stat, but in the first game just defense, because again, special was just one stat. In ranking these Pokemon, we'll go gym by gym, and we'll take into account overall type matchup, available movesets at that level, and stat leanings to determine who would do the best, second best, and third best at each gym and Elite Four member. Your rank gets you that point. 1, 2, or 3. And at the end of the ranking, whoever has the least points overall will be the best starter definitively for Generation 1. And since we have Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Gen 3 remakes of Red and Blue, if it becomes necessary, I will differentiate a score between Red and Blue and Fire Red Leaf Green. And frankly, Red and Blue did not age very well, so I'm sure there will be some important distinctions as we go on. Now let's get into the ranking. Number 1, the Pewter Gym, led by Brock, the Rock-type specialist. The ranking for the first 3 gyms in Kanto, a lot of you are going to know in advance, because it's sort of a well-known idea in the community that the Gen 1 starters are the built-in difficulty settings for the game, and we'll find out if that's true for sure, but spoiler alert, it kind of is. In this first gym, it's just Geodude and Onix. Charmander is at the biggest disadvantage here, being weak to both rock and ground, but it is important to note that in Red and Blue, they actually don't have any rock or ground moves, which is kind of crazy to think about, but they still resist normal and fire attacks, so Charmander is at the biggest disadvantage, no matter what. Bulbasaur and Squirtle are sort of at a tie here, but since the level cap for this gym is 14, Squirtle only has Bubble, a 20 power move, while Bulbasaur has Vine Whip, a 35 power move. Not to mention in Gen 1, both Grass and Water are special type moves, so even though Vine Whip is a physical move, in Gen 1, Bulbasaur gets to use its higher special stat to do a little more damage on top. Bulbasaur gets the number 1 spot here, followed by Squirtle and trailed far behind by Charmander, but still just a 1, 2, and 3 point spread respectively. Number 2, the Cerulean Gym, led by Misty, the water type leader. This one's actually much more straightforward. Once again, Bulbasaur, or likely by this point Ivysaur, is super effective here, especially in Gen 1, where Staryu isn't even a psychic type to put a little bit of danger on that half-poison typing. But even if it was something to consider, Wartortle at this point has nothing super effective here, and Charmeleon is again at a major disadvantage. So like the first gym, the point spread will be number 1 to Ivysaur, number 2 to Wartortle, and number 3 to Charmeleon. Number 3, the Vermilion Gym, led by Lieutenant Surge, the electric-type specialist. This is where the list starts to even out and actually become interesting, because these are just 3 straight electric types, and since Charmeleon is still pure fire, not getting flying type until its last evolution, the only one here at any disadvantage is Wartortle, being weak to electric moves, obviously. But Grass still resists electric, making our point spread for this gym a slightly new of Ivysaur at number 1, Charmeleon at number 2, and Wartortle at number 3. And yeah, that old adage is correct. The fact that Bulbasaur has little to no issue with the first 3 gyms, Squirtle has little to no issue with the first 2 gyms, and Charmander has an issue the whole time is pretty indicative of the quote difficulty settings for the early game. But it's important to note that it's just the early game. So let's see how the rest of this list shakes out, starting with our next gym. Number 4, the Celadon Gym, led by Erica, the grass-type specialist. On the surface, this seems straightforward, because okay, it's grass, so obviously Charmeleon is going to have the advantage here. Ivysaur will resist the grass move, so it'll get number 2, and Wartortle is a water type, so it'll get number 3, right? Well, that's not the full picture, because at this point in the game, we're starting to get a lot of TMs. And while yes, Ivysaur resists the grass moves and Wartortle is weak to them, Wartortle can learn a lot of TMs that Ivysaur can't. Namely, Wartortle can learn both Dig and Ice Beam by this point in the game. We get the Dig TM on the floor of that robbed house all the way back in Cerulean City, and if you go to the Celadon City department store roof and give this thirsty girl one of each beverage, you get 3 TMs, one of them being Ice Beam. Anyway, because Ivysaur at this point has nothing super effective against this gym, but Wartortle has 2 amazing options, I'm actually going to give the stat spread to Charmeleon at number 1 because it's still a fire type, but Wartortle at number 2, and Ivysaur at the number 3 spot. Number 5, the Fuchsia Gym, led by Koga, the poison type specialist. By this level cap, we are now all fully evolved, which makes my job a lot easier. I don't have to continuously check different forms and what moves they can learn. But Koga similarly is in an interesting position. At first, all 3 Pokemon appear to be on equal footing, except for Venusaur, because this is a poison type gym, and while none of them naturally learn any moves that are good against poison type Pokemon, Venusaur can't be poisoned because it's a poison type. So even though poison moves are neutral against it, it still can't get the poison status effect. But remember TMs? Something that we're going to find really holds Venusaur back in Pokemon Red and Blue is that for whatever reason in Gen 1, Venusaur cannot learn any ground type TMs, not Earthquake and not Dig, which frankly is insane. I don't understand why the grass-type dinosaur Pokemon can't dig in the ground, but it was corrected in Fire Red and Leaf Green. This, however, is such a meaningful difference that we're going to have to do our first split score. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, everything is the same, but all 3 Pokemon can learn Earthquake via TM. So since they're all on equal footing, but Charizard has a higher attack stat than Blastoise, the order will be Venusaur at 1, Charizard at 2, and Blastoise at 3. But since in Red and Blue, Venusaur cannot learn any moves that are super effective against poison types, it will instead be Charizard at number 1, Blastoise at number 2, and then Venusaur at number 3. Number 6. The Saffron Gym, led by Sabrina, the psychic specialist. There's another difference between generations here, but it's not as strong, because it's not a great move this late into the game. On the surface of this gym, the only starter who has any kind of advantage here is Charizard, because one of Sabrina's Pokemon is not psychic, but instead a Venomoth, that's bug poison, and therefore weak to fire moves. So at first, Charizard is getting the slight edge here, but by Gen 3, Bite is a dark type move, which, while it is a weak move for this late in the game, is important, because that's the only dark type move that any of the Generation 1 starters get access to in Kanto, specifically Blastoise by Level Up. But again, that's only in Fire Red and Leaf Green. So in Red and Blue, Charizard squeaks by that number 1 spot. Blastoise gets number 2 once again, and Venusaur gets number 3, having nothing to go against it, but being weak to Psychic type as part Poison. But in Fire Red and Leaf Green, that slightly swaps in scales, giving Blastoise the number 1 spot thanks to Bite, Charizard number 2, and again Venusaur at number 3. I find it interesting to note that we're at Gym 6, and this is the first time Blastoise has gotten a number 1 spot, which is not looking very good for the turtle. Number 7, the Cinnabar Island Gym, led by Blaine, the fire specialist. Again, in Fire Red and Leaf Green, everybody can learn Earthquake, versus Red and Blue taking that away from Venusaur. But honestly, it doesn't make a meaningful difference here, because yes, Earthquake is a great move, but it's a fire-type gym. So at the end of the day, whether or not Venusaur can learn Earthquake, Blastoise wins. Charizard gets number 2, resisting fire, and Venusaur trails behind, no matter what. Number 8, the Viridian Gym, led by Giovanni, the ground-type specialist. At first I was worried for Charizard, since of these Pokemon, 2 of them are part rock-type. I would assume at least one of them would have like Rock Throw, but once again, at least in Red and Blue, there are no rock moves in this version of the team. And Charizard is actually immune to all the ground types here because it's part flying. But it is important to note that Charizard pretty much has nothing good here against any of these Pokemon move-wise, whereas all of them are weak to water-type moves. And I would say all of them are weak to grass as well, but both Nidoqueen and Nidoking are neutral because of their half-poison typing. So even if we want to say who can survive the longest, as far as offense offensive power goes, the answer is clear. Blastoise takes the win, followed by Venusaur and then Charizard in the rear. That's all 8 gym leaders, so let's take a quick break to see where we're at. For Red and Blue, right now, Blastoise is in the lead with 15. Charizard's just behind with 16, and Venusaur is just at the end with 17. Whereas in Fire Red and Leaf Green, there's actually a first place tie between Venusaur and Blastoise at 15, where Charizard trails behind at 18. But again, the biggest difference here is 3 points, so it really is anybody's game. And it's impressive that Blastoise has caught all the way up, but let's see if he can keep up that momentum, starting with Elite Four member number 1, Lorelei, the Ice-type specialist. Lorelei is technically water and Ice-type realistically, so both Grass and Fire are in a worse spot than you would think they would be. After all of her Pokemon at least partly resist Fire, so it's going to be neutral except for the Jinx, and all of those Ice-types have really good moves against your Venusaur. However, it is important to know that Ice, while effective against Grass, doesn't resist Grass, so Venusaur still has plenty of super effective moves against this entire team. As far as what Blastoise and Charizard are going to be doing, in both generations of the game, they have access to fighting type TMs, Submission in Red and Blue, and Brick Break in Fire Red and Leaf Green. So since Blastoise resists most of the moves used in this battle, I think the fairest judgment call to make is Venusaur getting the number 1 spot because of all those super effective stab moves, then Blastoise resisting Ice and having fighting moves, and Charizard in the rear. Elite Four member number 2, Bruno, the fighting type specialist. It's really hard to say these specialist titles with a straight face, because when you look at their team, half of their team aren't actually the type they specialize in. Bruno being a great example. Sure, he's got 3 fighting types, but 2 of them are just rock ground Pokemon. You know what? I just realized a lot of this confusion might stem from the card game, doesn't it? I never really thought about it because I haven't played the card game before Pocket TCG came out, which by the way, if you want to add me, here's my link. But I'm noticing that a lot of the rock and ground Pokemon are just fighting type. The same could be said about Ice to Water type. I'm gonna have to look into that more. That might be a full video. Anyway, the type matchups here are actually more split than you would think. Charizard is a flying type at this point, so it's good against the 3 fighting types on the team, and Venusaur and Blastoise are great against those 2 rock ground types. However, Charizard is weak to rock moves, and for once, we actually have some rock moves in this team with Rock Throw, only being known by Onix though, who's not an incredibly scary Pokemon to fight against. But since its Hitmonchan has both Ice Punch and Thunder Punch, all of the Pokemon here are in danger. I'm willing to say that Charizard is the most at risk though, so this is very close, but all of this in mind, and giving the fact that Poison resists fighting type, this very slight edge is going to go to Venusaur, giving it the win. Blastoise at number 2 and Charizard at number 3. Elite Four member number 3, Agatha, the ghost type specialist. Another scary Elite Four member because, again, none of the 3 starter Pokemon have any moves that they can know that are good against ghost types, especially in Gen 1 since Blastoise doesn't even have a dark type bite. But there's something more important going on here. While only 3 of her Pokemon are part ghost, all 5 of her Pokemon are at least part poison. And again, Charizard and Blastoise get Earthquake in Gen 1 when Venusaur doesn't. Folks, this is why we check our game knowledge. I'm recording this literally 2 hours before this goes live because I was finishing up and double checking things and I completely forgot something incredibly important. I had a whole 2-minute section here talking about how Earthquake completely swept this in favor of Charizard and Blastoise, forgetting that literally only one member of Agatha's team is able to be hit by ground type moves in Gen 3. In Generation 1, Pokemon don't have abilities yet, so only Golbat is the issue here. And like I mentioned, Charizard and Blastoise both have Earthquake, so nothing much changes there. But in Gen 3, while Venusaur gets Earthquake, Ghastly and Haunter both have Levitate. Gengar has the hidden ability Levitate. Now, I don't know if Agatha's Gengar has it. There's not a great source to find that. Either way, if she does or doesn't, that's more than half of her team immune to ground type moves. So previously, I gave this to Charizard because he had the highest attack, Blastoise at number 2, and number 3 to Venusaur for Red and Blue. And that's going to stay the same because, again, no abilities in Gen 1. But while I was going to say in Gen 3, because Venusaur gets Earthquake, Venusaur gets number 1, no one's using Earthquake here. So I think it's still going to go to Charizard, then Blastoise, then Venusaur once again. So this is actually a changed stat. But the overall winner is still the overall winner, so at least I don't have to re-record the outro. Elite Four member number 4, Lance, the Dragon-type specialist. Dragons are obviously a rough spot for all 3 of them, since Dragon resists all 3 of their main typings. And while Charizard does get Dragon Rage in Red and Blue, it only gets 40 damage. Always. Like, it doesn't even get affected by type weakness. Not to mention, Aerodactyl resists fire moves with that rock typing. But again, as we mentioned back with Erica, Blastoise gets access to Ice Beam in both generations. Speaking of generations, in Gen 3, Charizard gets access to Dragon Claw. So at the end of the day, with the moves available, in Red and Blue, I think Blastoise gets the number 1 spot. Venusaur gets number 2, and Charizard gets its number 3. But in Fire Red and Leaf Green, Blastoise retains the number 1 spot, but that Dragon Claw does bump Charizard up to the number 2 spot, giving Venusaur the number 3. Finally, one of the most challenging ones to rank, the champion, blue in Red and Blue and green in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but either way the same team. It's important to note that no matter what, the champion will always have a Fire, Water, Grass core in his team. He's got a Gyarados, Arcanine, and an Exeggutor, replacing one of those Pokemon with whatever starter he got at the beginning of the game. And while there are meaningful differences as to which Pokemon he's getting, because, I would argue Exeggutor is a bigger threat than Venusaur at some points, at the end of the day, all 3 starters will struggle with the back half of this team. So let's just focus on the front to look for meaningful differences. Alakazam, Pidgeot, and Rhydon. No one has an answer for Psychic-type Alakazam, except for that Dark-type Bite from Blastoise. So in Gen 1, that's a sore spot for everybody. Rhydon is a little bit scary for Charizard, but Charizard does have Submission, so he's not defenseless. And obviously Venusaur and Blastoise handle him no issue. As far as Pidgeot goes, Normal Flying is a rough type matchup for all 3 starters, but Venusaur is uniquely weak to it because of the Flying-type moves. This one was possibly the hardest to rank, but trying to be as objective as possible, I think I have to give the number 1 spot for both generations to Blastoise, then Charizard just behind, and Venusaur just behind again because of that unique Pidgeot weakness, whereas everyone has something effective against Rhydon. So at the end of all of this, with the scores totaled, who's the best starter Pokemon for the Kanto region? In both Red and Blue and Fire Red and Leaf Green, surprisingly, the winner by 5 and 4 points respectively, Blastoise. In both games, somehow it averaged out to a score of 22, and in both games, 27 and 26 respectively, Venusaur got second, and 29 and 30, Charizard got third. Frankly, it came down to Blastoise's vast move pool and access to moves like Ice Beam, Earthquake, and Submission, even though its attack and special attack are weaker than Charizard and Venusaur. These moves make Blastoise a force to be reckoned with in the Kanto region, which is funny because I've never used a Blastoise in a playthrough. I've always preferred Bulbasaur and gone for it every single time, but I think I might just go back and play it with a Squirtle to see how that goes. Obviously, all 3 of these Pokemon are great, and you want to have a team of diverse types in Pokemon to fill out each Pokemon's weakness, so you would never have to beat the game with just a Blastoise. But with the moves available to it, that's probably your best option. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you disagree with what I think is a fairly objective ranking, and I want to make more of these for more generations, so if you have any tips, pointers, or complaints, let me know in the comments. But if you want to know about a ranking that's a little less objective, last week I ranked what the best kart racing video game was, and you can find that video right here. In the meantime, you've been watching Rytoost. Of all the channels on YouTube, it's the second one. Stay toasty, Slices.